Welcome, Dr. Roslyn.
Thank you. And my co-presenter is Dr. Carmen Medina. She's also a keynote, so she will start us off and we will start with our presentation about teaching for the virtual world.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I'd like to thank everyone that is attending, and I'd like to start with answering. Our presentation is going to try to answer 4 questions, like when is virtual learning the right choice? What does virtual teaching entail? What is the profile of a virtual learner and teacher? And how to teach virtually, creatively, engaging and retaining students. So let's start by answering our first question. So Brian and Leiber back in 1999 already defined the virtual learning environment as a web-based platform that modeled the face-to-face classroom. The COVID pandemic has taught the world that virtual learning and teaching is possible practically overnight. However, the aftermath severe lockdowns has also proven that not all teachers or students are suited or prepared for the virtual learning environment. Teachers need to develop a virtual environment mindset. Many of them don't have the skills, the experience, nor do they want the skills or the experience. And this is a reality which also raises its own questions. For instance, will there be 2 categories of teachers, the face-to-face ones and the virtual learning environment ones? And will this lead to discrimination? And how will this be dealt with? Teachers also need training. They need tools, and they need to differentiate face-to-face from the virtual environment. It doesn't suffice to simply upload materials to Google Classroom, Moodle, Edmodo, or whatever LMS you're using. There needs to be a human interaction, and there needs to be some feedback. Due to time constraints, these are just a few of the issues that teachers, trainers, and authorities have to address. With regards to the students, if diversity is a pressing issue in the face-to-face classroom, it increases exponentially in the virtual learning environment as they have to deal with mastering the digital world, the LMS or the apps that we're using, their own personality and character traits, as well as their backgrounds. Access to the tools. It's not the same to work from a smartphone as it is to work from a laptop, an iPad, or a tablet. And so this is already going to be a divide within the students because of their backgrounds and whether or not they have the financial possibilities to have the correct tool. And as well, they need to have access to a safe and reliable connection. Okay, so this section, like just answering this question, like when is the virtual learning choice right, would allow for hours and hours of discussion. So I'm going to move on to our second question. So what is teaching virtually? As mentioned before, not all teachers are prepared to or attracted to the virtual learning environment, just as not all teachers follow the same methodology or have the same teaching philosophy. So what are some of these traits? Well, for instance, being creative, like coming up with many varied tasks, exercise types, gamifying, and so on. Differentiating instruction, in other words, creating tasks to meet students' individual needs and learning styles. This is never an easy task, and let alone in a virtual environment. Scaffolding instruction. Regardless of the environment, we still need to modify and adapt tasks in order to help all students be successful with a particular content, and making sure that students have all the necessary resources and tools as soon as possible, like checking in periodically to follow up, to make adjustments, to receive feedback, and so on. Also, choosing a platform may not be a responsibility that goes with us as instructors. Simply, our institution decides on a platform, and we have to go along with that platform. And of course, we have to learn how to use that platform. And then patience is on last, but it's not unimportant, because everything and anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So students might be late to the presentation, students might not be able to connect to the class, we as teachers might not be able to connect to the class, the connection might be interrupted, the connection might be slow, the video might have disappeared, and if it was on YouTube, maybe it was removed, it might be slow, and so forth. So we're online, it doesn't just depend on us. And for instance, I had a class where the internet connection was lost because of the weather, and we had to continue via WhatsApp. But just as we react in a face-to-face classroom, I guess, with years and time of expertise in the learning environment, we also learn to react within the learning environment. So Thierry Hike at TeachThought reviews 9 principles for student engagement in the learning environment. The first one, which is lesson design and context, he proposes experimenting with active learning, that is participation from every student every day. The second one is motivation and psychology. That's different factors motivate different students. It could be the grades, it could be the teacher or parent praise. We have to identify those motivators because they're going to be key to that student engagement. The roles and perspectives. We know that there are 2 basic roles in a classroom. That's the teacher, the student. The teacher is there to teach, the student is there to learn, theoretically. But what if we add roles and responsibilities to the students? For instance, keeping attendance, spotting peer queries, hesitation, lack of participation, and so forth. Hosting a session, maybe even like taking turns in hosting a session, keeping a diary, assigning orders or turns, and so forth. Anything that will give the students or the possibility of being responsible for their learning on the virtual learning environment. The 4th principle is space and climate. Students and teachers should have an assigned space and a quiet time for their virtual classes, and for participating and practicing both synchronously and asynchronously. Because in a face-to-face classroom, if there's noise in the halls, you're distracted. Well, likewise, in a virtual learning environment, if there's noise in the background, then you're not going to be as focused as you should be. The 5th one, structures and flexibility. This was mentioned before in the panel. The virtual learning environment needs structure and order, and perhaps even more so than the face-to-face classroom. The students need a sort of roadmap that they can follow. This doesn't mean that you're going to be inflexible as an instructor. It just means that you're going to have to readjust content or backtrack, move forward, skip content, and so forth. But you have to make sure that the students are with you, that you haven't lost them. The 6th principle that he mentions is collaboration and independence. If building a classroom environment is important in the face-to-face classroom, even more so in the online environment. Why? Because building a team where students can interact without restrictions, without anxiety is paramount, because they're talking to a machine, as I am now. So knowing that there are people out there and that they're safe if they make mistakes, especially because we're teaching a foreign language. So it's safe if they make a mistake, nobody's going to ridicule them and so forth. All right. So for instance, I have a breaking news where students share interesting content and they comment on developments. For instance, we can create web quests or riddles, quizzes, trivia, and so forth, so that they can collaborate amongst themselves. It doesn't always have to be engagement with the teacher. The 7th is inclusion and equity. As mentioned earlier, trying to get each and every student involved in some way. In a face-to-face classroom, you can actually check the faces and you can check whether or not they're distracted. In a virtual learning environment, it's much harder, particularly if you're in a setting where you're not seeing the student. The 8th one, interfaces and interactions. Well, the worldwide study from home emergency that the COVID pandemic has created has magnified public and private companies to offer, develop, and share classroom-specific artificial intelligence to help both teachers and students with the best possible teaching, learning experience. And we'll see that in the next slide. And finally, but not least important, communication and accessibilities. Students should know when you're available for both synchronous chats and when you're going to be online. You don't have to be online 24/7, but students should know when there's an emergency, how they can get in touch with you. And then Slides 6 and 7 are a list of tools. They're all interactive. They're all live. So you can click on them and they will take you to the different tools. I've divided them more or less in like videos, Nearpod, which can adapt practically everything, places where you can take virtual tours, Biblionasium, which is a school, a reading club, and Padlet, which everyone knows, and so forth. Okay, and then assessment. We were talking about assessment before. There are so many tools for assessment. And Roz, over to you. I think I went fairly quickly.
So I will be covering the last few slides of the presentation. Thank you, Dr. Medina. So for example, in this slide, e-learning we know isn't for everyone. So here are some possible questions that parents or even instructors could ask students whether or not they're suited for distance learning. With the pandemic, what we've seen there and the trends in the data has shown that some kids have excelled perfectly, and some people it's perfect distance learning because it's time management skills that they have and they adaptations to that. However, there are others that have not, and that's why some of our online courses have gone to hybrid, because then there are some face-to-face time sessions and some asynchronous and synchronous combinations that may be beneficial for students. So the first question for really understanding, are you suited for online learning and what that might mean to you? Next slide, please. All right, so in the next slide, we have to talk about how to be creative in the virtual world. So there's an acronym called BOOST, Constraints, and Sparks, and they both align to learning theories. So BOOST aligns to the behaviorist theory of learning, which is virtual behaviors can be applied through step-by-step video tutorials, game-based activities, constructive feedback, and quizzes. Constraints align to the cognitivism theory of learning, which is then the content that is tailored to learners and their cognitive abilities, also promoting learner autonomy. One of the things that in a virtual world, we know a lot of it is no longer teacher-centered, it's student-centered. So we have to make that shift and that mindset to understanding that we're in a virtual world and the learning is now shifted from me, the instructor who's the facilitator of the learning, into more of a student-centered learning. And that allows for this to promote that learner autonomy and give ownership to the learning to the participant in the course. And then Sparks is aligned to your social constructivist theory of learning, which is your teaching strategies, the strategies that you use, the discussions, the brainstorming, the problem-based learning, the project-based learning. All these activities align to engaging your students as being part of their learning process. Next, please. Now, in a non-virtual classroom, we tend to apply what we call the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. No different as it is for a virtual room. It just tends to look differently. So here we have the idea of concept of UDL, which is multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, multiple means of engagement, and multiple means of assessment. The instructor in a virtual world will apply the same principles to like they would in a face-to-face classroom setting, but it'll just look a little bit differently in a virtual world. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. So understanding our role as a teacher, like I mentioned before, we are now in a virtual world. So what does that look like? We are facilitators of the learning. Nothing has really changed from what we were in that brick and mortar building. We are still the facilitators. We still guide and plan to transfer learning through those 4 principles of UDL. Next slide, please. In this slide, we understand that even in a virtual environment, teacher instructors or facilitators are facilitators of learning. They become the bridge that transfers learning into the manner of multiple means of expression of content. So we are able to provide, like in the previous slides that you saw with the tools, we're able to provide instruction in multiple different ways and multiple different ways of representing the content so that we're applying to all different learning styles. Multiple means of action and expression through our lesson planning and our instructional strategies, if we're using project-based learning or problem-based learning or discussions, or we're using Socratic discussion, any of those instructional strategies that we as teachers use in a classroom could be represented in giving the students more that time to have their action and expression, and showing you that they understand the learning and the content. Also, multiple means of engagement through the various platforms like Nearpod and Peer Deck and Canvas and the multitude of others that we had on that slide. You can have various ways to engage your students. Also, in multiple means of assessment through the platform, we have multiple ways to assess our students now, and assessment is looked at very differently. Assessment doesn't always have to be formal. It could be informal in various different ways, just as a simple intro task or a simple exit task. All these things can allow for various ways of assessing students. Now, taking a look at our virtual classroom. Here's an example of how to become creative in the virtual world by creating what we call a Bitmoji Classroom to add with your virtual instructions. So you could use a Bitmoji Classroom with your Google Classroom, your Canvas Classroom, your Blackboard Classroom, however you choose to use it. It's the same as if you were to use a web page, but this is more interactive, especially in a K-12 setting. So this slide represents instructions for students to use the Bitmoji Classroom. So basically how you start is using just simple Microsoft PowerPoint slide and creating the directions for each icon that would be linked and interactive for the students to have an access for various resources as they go through their learning process. Next slide, please. And what it looks like is this. Here's an example of a Bitmoji Classroom. Here's what it looks like. Each icon is linked to a resource for students to access at any time for instructional purposes and support. It is just similar to, like I mentioned before, a Google web page. Each icon is interactive, and it represents that brick and mortar classroom in a virtual world. So just like you would have your classroom set up or your instructional area set up in a brick and mortar building, you have it set up virtually now with interactive links and procedures and resources for your students. And like I said before, it can be linked to any type of platform that you're using. Next slide, please. And now we have questions and answers. So we're going to open up the platform for any questions, and we can hopefully be able to answer in the time available to us. And thank you for listening to us today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is a Q&A time. If anyone has any questions, please ask.
Oh. I'm looking in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat. So if you want to answer the chat, I am also monitoring the chat.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Dr. Hala, how are you?
Can you demonstrate the Bitmoji they've asked?
Oh, the Bitmoji. Okay, I didn't include the slide in here to be interactive.
Can you go to it?
Let me see if I can get to it really quickly for you.
Do you want me to stop sharing so that you can share?
Hold on, let me pull it up first, and then
Okay.
I will be able to okay, if you stop sharing.
Okay. There you go.
Okay, hold on. Here we are. It's not live. Hold on. 1 second.
Is it live?
I'm pulling it up right
We've
now.
got like 3 minutes left.
All right, so let me share my screen. And then I can show you the Bitmoji. Okay, so here in the Bitmoji Classroom, you will see how it's set up. So if the student were to click on the icon, the schedule, they would have the schedule for the day like they normally would in the building that might be displayed. And the calendar here, you would see that if they were to click on the calendar, all their assignments that they would have to do for the day would appear, anything that's coming up, any events. They will have, like, for example, the brain breaks. If they wanted to do some brain breaks exercises, they can click here. If they wanted to have resources, would be the bins down here. Like, for example, when we use graphic organizers, you would see the little bin here with the graphic organizers, so they can go in there, and we might say to them, oh, we're going to use the concept map today. They can click here and get the concept map. The library would be linked to books or stories that we might be reading in the class at that same time, and with the audio that they can listen to. The Apple, like before we said in this slide, the Apple was for online department meetings for us, or any kind of meetings or so forth. And each one of these icons are linked to something or a resource in the classroom. And once you click on it, it'll take the students directly there. I will stop sharing. All right, any other questions really quickly? Well, you're welcome.
The only problem is with this is that it's Google based, right?
Yeah,
And so not all countries will have the
access
option.
to Google, and we use in the United States, we use a lot of we use Google Classroom, so we use a lot of the Google features in there, like Flipgrid and webcam, and all those different kinds of different things that we have.
Yeah, Jamboard instead of using the Padlet. Yeah.
The Padlets.
And nowadays, even Nearpod has Google integrated into it as well.
Yes, so we have a lot of those options too. And if you don't use, like, even if you use Canvas, a lot of these other additional things also work very well together. And you can also do a Weebly also if they don't want to do, if you can't do a Google like platform, you can use Weebly.
Okay. That I didn't know that you could use Weebly.
Yeah, you can use Weebly as well. We've used Weebly as also too.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Roz.
Nope. It's 4:32 and I'm wide awake.
So you can you can have a coffee and go back to sleep. See you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you, Dr. Roslyn, and thank you, Carmen. Thank you very much for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.